Hello and welcome to Frankly Speaking, where we examine the region's biggest stories with the leaders shaping them. I am Katie Jensen. On this episode, we speak with Nomi Bar-Yaacov, a human rights lawyer and international peace negotiator who has spent decades working on some of the world's most difficult conflicts. Just over 3 months on from Operation Epic Fury, tensions across the Middle East are still running high, from Gaza and Lebanon to Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. So was this war a strategic success or the start of a much bigger regional crisis? And as diplomacy struggles to contain the fallout, is the region slipping into a far more dangerous phase? Ms. Bar-Yaacov, thank you for joining us today on Frankly Speaking. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much, Katie, for having me on your show.
Well, we are now just over 3 months post the launch of Operation Epic Fury, and we've gone from regime change to ridding Iran of its nuclear ambitions to negotiating to reopen and demine the Strait of Hormuz. Frankly speaking, do you think Operation Epic Fury was an epic failure?
Frankly speaking, I do think it was an epic failure, and I think that there is no question about it. We're in a far worse place now than we were when Operation Epic Fury, that then changed names after 60 days to quote unquote Project Freedom. And now I don't know what we're turning into, but we are a long way away from a peaceful, sustainable resolution to the conflict. And I think that we were actually on the brink of an agreement on the 26th of February this year, 2 days before the US and Israel launched the attacks on Iran, when the Omani mediators basically set a date for the technical side of negotiations on the nuclear file. That always is a sign that serious progress is being made when you move from a framework agreement to the technical side of agreements. And here we're not quite there. The devil is always in the details. So it's far more complicated. And this Iranian so-called new regime, an offshoot of the old regime, is much more dangerous than the old regime.
And of course, speaking of some of that tension, I mean, you mentioned the fact that Oman was acting as mediator, and then just days ago we heard President Trump threatening to blow Oman up. So clearly a lot of tension taking place inside that alliance. Just a few days ago, you told Al Arabiya that the war effort had become so difficult that it's actually created a real rift between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. Tell me, what makes you believe that that relationship has genuinely deteriorated now?
Oh, I know it's deteriorated. I know from my own sources that President Trump has been screaming down the line on, a Prime Minister Netanyahu. Prime Minister Netanyahu has had 7 visits during this particular second term in office, 7 visits to the White House, in which he was working very hard to get the US president to bomb Iran. And he promised him, this is Netanyahu promising Trump, that regime change is going to be a matter, just flick your finger. So clearly that didn't take place. And I thought, if you assassinate the supreme leader, the late Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and a few of his associates, then that the people will rise. Or this idea that the Kurds are going to be able to instigate a regime change is ludicrous. And I think the Israeli intelligence has been catastrophic in terms of its forecast, in terms of strategy. They're good on tactics. They're good on assassinating those they want to assassinate. They can target. But you can ask the same question on Iran, the same question on Gaza, the same question on Lebanon. What is the strategy? There's a lot of killing. There's a lot of misery. There is a trajectory that is developing, has been developing since Netanyahu took office, especially with this particular extreme messianic government that is extremely, extremely dangerous. But the good news is that there are going to be elections in a few months in Israel, and there is an awful lot of opposition to this current government. So there is a silver lining at the end here. So we do need to try to focus on the change of the trajectory and how to get there in terms of what the work carved out for peace negotiators and policymakers in the region.
And obviously, we've even seen President Trump say lately that he might plan to run for a Prime Minister of Israel as well. But tell me, where do you think the real breakdown really began? I think in many respects, President Trump really expected to copy and paste from Venezuela and what happened there. But tell me, do you believe the New York Times story that came out quite early in the conflict, essentially that Prime Minister Netanyahu may have oversold what the war could realistically achieve to President Trump? Because the flip side, there's also been many who've argued that actually it was the other way around and that Washington rushed Israel into the conflict against Israeli advice without giving enough time to properly plan a real strategy.
No, I don't think that Washington rushed Israel. I think this has been Netanyahu's dream in the making for decades. And Netanyahu has, for many decades, been saying that Iran is a threat not only to Israel, but to the whole world, and that the regime needs to change. The Ayatollahs need to be taken out. That's not only the Ayatollahs that were taken out, but all the Ayatollahs, and that the world, in Netanyahu's words, doesn't understand the threat. So it's been his mission, and I have no doubt whatsoever that it was Netanyahu who persuaded Trump. He also tried to persuade him during his first term. So the question is, what changed in the second term? And I think that during Trump's first term, Netanyahu also tried to persuade Trump to attack Iran, but Trump resisted. He had many advisors who were experts in the region, who advised him not to attack Iran. But he did and this particular term, the second Trump 2 as it's known, he's gotten rid of all these advisors, and he's surrounded himself with non-experts, with property moguls that are not particularly experts in the region. And it's a complicated region. You are in the region, and there isn't the know-how or the knowledge in the White House, and there isn't the know-how of how to operate. So I think that's what happened. And that was what happened between the first term and the second term. But don't forget that Netanyahu did persuade the US president in his first term to withdraw in May 2018 from the JCPOA, from the nuclear agreement, following staged address to Congress. So yes, I think that it was that way around.
I mean, there's also the concern as well that obviously Mr. Netanyahu himself is under extreme pressure from many of the extreme right within his party as well. I know something you said before in an interview with Times Radio. You've said that he's heavily constrained, perhaps even captured by his far-right coalition partners. I guess the big concern is, does that now make a genuine two-state solution politically impossible under this government, regardless of international pressure?
Well, I think two-state solution is the only solution that we have, because, we have the Arab Peace Initiative that Saudi Arabia had launched, and then followed by all states of the Arab League, including Iran, signing onto it. We have spoilers like Hamas that ensured that the deal won't be implemented. But quite frankly, it is the only plan for a resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which lies at the heart of the matter. So with Ben Gvir and Smotrich and these messianic ministers in Netanyahu's government, I don't think he's constrained. I think he's green-lighting everything. He knows exactly what's going on, and he is the prime minister. He's a very experienced prime minister, and he can stop them if he wants to. But he has allowed for this to happen, and really now we're on the brink of the number of things that the new government in Israel that will take office after the elections will have to contend with. That is the fact that de facto much of the West Bank, and actually de jure, according to Israeli law, has been annexed. 60% of Gaza at present is occupied by Israel, a very large percentage of territory that expands by the minute in Lebanon. So there is an awful lot that they will need to do. But I do think that Netanyahu is at the helm, and he is not necessarily, I may have said he's constrained by them, but actually it's his choice. He did not have to form a coalition with them, and he chose to. But I think the public in Israel is really fed up with the extreme government. And I think that you're not going to see these ministers win the election.
So you feel Mr. Netanyahu is not going to win the election, that essentially he fundamentally opposes Palestinian statehood regardless of coalition policies. I guess the big question then is that if that is the case, is the international community still even dealing with a government capable of negotiating peace in good faith?
Well, I don't think the Netanyahu government is trying to negotiate peace in good faith. And I didn't say that he won't be the next prime minister. I said that the extreme right-wing parties in his government will not be in office. This is a very important distinction. You know with Netanyahu, he's such a shrewd, calculating politician. It's not possible for me to tell you now what he's going to pull out of how many rabbits he has in the hat and which rabbit he's going to pull just before the election. Of course, the hope is that there will be a plea bargain for his trial, and as part of the plea bargain, he will admit to some lesser charges than the ones that are on the table, and he will step down from running for office again. But that is not a done deal yet, but that is what is being discussed. And so, again, with Israeli politics, it's quite hard to predict exactly what is going to happen, but I can firmly predict that the extremes within his government are not going to be in the new government. There are a number of opposition parties that have said that they will join forces with Netanyahu if he does win the election. So he's not out yet, but if he forms a new coalition, it will be with more moderate parties. And that's very, very significant and very important.
And hopefully we do see some of that change. And again, as you mentioned, the big concern is that once this war comes to an end, Mr. Netanyahu is facing this corruption trial. And we continue to see the fact he wants these conflicts to continue. But I want to move sideways a little bit, because I think another important point is that alongside the conflict itself, President Trump has recently come out and said he's still pushing for more Arab and Muslim countries to join the Abraham Accords. But as you know, as I know, and much of the audience, Jordan and Egypt already have peace agreements with Israel before the Accords. Turkey has maintained relations with Israel for decades, and Saudi Arabia continues to insist on Palestinian statehood. So I have to wonder, doesn't that suggest a serious misunderstanding of the region from President Trump?
Well, it's one way of putting it, is that it's a serious misunderstanding, and it's another way to put it that the pressure is coming from Netanyahu himself, and that the relationship between the two men is an extraordinary one. And I would assume, as they are negotiating the memorandum of understanding with the Iranians, and President Trump would like to have some sort of family photo and announce some great peace agreement, that the pressure is coming from Netanyahu, because of course that would give him the legacy that he is interested in. I don't think there's any chance whatsoever that any of the Gulf states that are not party to the Abraham Accords will will join the Abraham Accords until there is a new government and a serious path towards Palestinian statehood. At the moment, there is occupation in the West Bank. 60% of Gaza is occupied. All of South Lebanon is occupied, and the Israeli army is moving further north by the minute. So I don't see any of the states joining the Abraham Accords. I think that's just a negotiation tactic on the part of Trump, egged on by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
And I think that tends to be quite a feeling we're seeing in this part of the region, for sure. I want to turn more specifically to what we're seeing in Gaza right now, because I think everyone talks about the day after in Gaza, but frankly, nobody seems to agree on what that actually looks like. Now, if Hamas cannot fully be eliminated, the Palestinian Authority, frankly, lacks legitimacy, and Arab states have refused direct responsibility for Gaza. What exactly is left? Part siege, part insurgency, part occupation, or something else? Occupation or something else?
Well, there is an occupation, as I said, of 60% of the Strip at the moment, and that occupation has to end. And in order for that occupation to end, there needs to be the Palestinian technocratic government that has been appointed and agreed on. currently residing in Egypt needs to get into Gaza. And the High Representative, Nikolai Mladenov, has to move to Gaza. And the Hamas is there, they're not going anywhere. So one has to deal with them. No Arab state is going to disarm Hamas. So the process is very complicated. And again, the solution really is to get to Palestinian statehood on the basis of the Arab Peace Initiative and to offer alternatives. If you don't offer alternatives to the extremes, you're going to get more and more extremes. Military action isn't going anywhere. Military action just creates more extremes. And with every assassination, you get another leader that is just as extreme or more extreme, but certainly not less extreme. So that is very clear, goes back to what I said earlier. The strategy isn't working. Military action isn't working. And in order, it actually is counterproductive, not just in Gaza, also in Lebanon. So it just strengthens the extremes and weakens those who are interested in reconciliation and peace. I do believe there is a path for peace. I believe that the people both of Palestine and of Lebanon and of Israel want peace. And I do think the winds are changing. And I think that with elections in Palestine, I think in Lebanon, there already have been elections and the government has very bravely called for direct talks, peace talks with Israel. And the issue will be when will Israel withdraw to the international border? They withdrew 6 years ago on the 25th of May of 2000 to the international border, so they can do it again. But again, we need we need both for Iran and for Gaza and for Lebanon, a verification compliance mechanism, monitoring verification and compliance of any agreement, from a ceasefire to all the main benchmarks towards a comprehensive agreement. The process is complex, and at every single point, there has to be a dispute resolution mechanism, and there has to be a monitoring, verification, and compliance mechanism. And of course, the Arab states, including, of course, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, would be playing a very important part in ensuring that there is a deflection, so that in conflicts, there will always be violations of ceasefire, always, in every conflict. And there'll always be violations of peace agreement. And if you're looking at the peace agreement you mentioned, Egypt and with Jordan, they're continuously being violated. But there is a mechanism in place to resolve the disputes in a non-military fashion, in a peaceful manner. And that's what is necessary to build in to all three conflicts.
And I think that's a big issue. So many big hurdles, challenges remain. And I want to ask you about what's been happening between US and Iran and Israel this week. But first, we've obviously seen things escalating in Lebanon as well. This conflict is spilling far beyond Gaza itself. So when we look at Lebanon, with Hezbollah and Israel increasingly drawn into a long-term conflict, do you think that governments are still actually leading the negotiations in the region, or are armed groups like Hezbollah now the real centres of power?
No, I don't think Hezbollah is the real center of power. I think the government of Lebanon is a fantastic government that needs strengthening. And, you can see, for example, that in Syria, Ahmed al-Shara is getting so much money from so many countries. And then I'm asking the question, why isn't the Lebanese government getting the money that they need in order to strengthen the Lebanese institutions, in order for the Lebanese army to be able to disarm Hezbollah? They have more or less the same number of troops and fighters. The Lebanese army has 50,000 troops. The Hezbollah have 50,000 fighters who are willing to fight to death. It's not easy for the Lebanese army to carry out its obligation under UN resolutions to disarm Hezbollah. They need all the help that they can get. But I think the power lies with the governments, and with every minute that the Israeli army is occupying Lebanon, they're strengthening Hezbollah and weakening the government. And that is why we need the international community to play the role of ensuring that this conflict ends. There are direct talks ongoing in Washington. That is a good thing. There needs to be the international support behind it in order to ensure that a peace deal is sealed.
But I have to wonder, can Lebanon really function as a fully sovereign state while Hezbollah still operates as an independent military force? It's one thing to have the alleged leaders of the country, people like Joseph Aoun, taking place in these negotiations. But while Hezbollah still has such a hold, how do we solve that disconnect?
No, I think that the solution, again, I stress the point, the raison d'etre of Hezbollah is Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories. And that needs to be resolved as part of the problem. Hezbollah was born in 1983 after Israel occupied Lebanon and, all the way up to Beirut in 1982. Then Hezbollah was weakened after Israel withdrew to the international border. And now it's being strengthened again with all the assassinations strengthened the resolve of Hezbollah and occupying so much of southern Lebanon, not only the south, and issuing forced evacuation orders. And the scale of the bombardment is actually unprecedented. Israel has stated, the Israeli army, the Israeli prime minister, the Israeli chief of staff, that they want to level all of southern Lebanon. So clearly that has to be stopped imminently. Otherwise, Hezbollah will be strengthened.
But how do we stop it? Because hasn't diplomacy repeatedly failed to shift that balance on the ground?
Diplomacy always has its ups and downs. So I think that we need to take a sort of deep breath here and see how can we make diplomacy work, because the only solution is diplomatic. There is no military solution to any of the conflicts that we've been discussing. So we just need to strengthen the diplomatic path, because it is dialogue and is the only way forward, coupled with the carrots and sticks that various governments have. So we really need to get a coalition of the willing, because all the Gulf states are interested in stability. If Lebanon falls into, becomes again a failed state, if there's going to be a civil war again in Lebanon, that will threaten the whole region. So it's in every state's interest to ensure that the peace process between Israel and Lebanon succeeds, or at least at the first stage, that there is an agreement on Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon, and including a real ceasefire, not a ceasefire that Israel and Hezbollah violate daily, a ceasefire where there is a monitoring, verification, compliance mechanism, and where there are serious sanctions for violations.
And I think that's been the big issue, the fact that we've seen violations on both sides since the very beginning of the ceasefire. I mean, increasingly, we're seeing all of these regional conflicts no longer being isolated. How do you ultimately see the broader regional confrontation involving Israel, Iran, as well as Iranian-backed groups ending? Is there still a conceivable diplomatic off-ramp for both sides, or are we entering a prolonged era of managed regional instability?
Well, I'm hoping at the moment it looks that way. There is regional instability and it requires management, but there is a solution, and the solution is to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict along the lines of the Saudi-led Arab Peace Initiative, later known as, Arab Vision. I mean, there are all sorts of permutations, but the issue is there has to be a withdrawal to the 67 borders plus minus. Now, we know, because we live in this world, that it's not going to be the 67 border as it stood in 67. There'll have to be some adjustment on a one-to-one exchange of territory. The maps have been drawn. There are plenty of good NGOs in Israel that are working very, very hard to implement that plan, or at least to publicize the plans, so that it is known not only in Israel but also around the Arab world that it is possible to have a contiguous states between Gaza and the West Bank. The Camp David discussed this in great detail. The plans are on the table. New maps have been drawn. With every minute that the Israeli government is allowed to take over another farm and expel another Bedouin or Palestinian village, this is becoming more and more under threat. But there is a solution, and that is where really I call on international action, because it's really important not to sanction one minister or another minister or one extreme settler. It's the whole movement. And now Bezalel Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister, is responding to an ICC indictment against him by expelling more Palestinians from their villages, really on the brink of threatening the implementation of two states. So it's an urgent call to open one's eyes, see what's going on, and take real action. I mean, these settlers only respond to sanctions. They don't respond to diplomatic statements. And that is a catastrophic failure of diplomacy, that Israel has been allowed to continue with settlements to the extent that it did. And it's not just the Netanyahu government, it started under Labour governments. But we need to learn lessons from the catastrophic failures and be proactive and ensure that there's not going to be one more Palestinian expelled or beaten up in Palestine, in the West Bank, or Gaza for that matter. But in order to allow for a solution based on two states, based on the Green Line with some adjustments that are mutually agreed on, based on reconciliation between the Palestinian factions, and moving forward, that is how Hezbollah and Iran, and again I stress, Iran had signed on to the Arab Peace Initiative. So the core is there, but as long as Israel continues with the occupation and mistreats Palestinians, we're backpedaling. So
and of course,
it's
also become not even just the mistreatment of Palestinians. We saw that horrific video released about a week or so ago that has had international condemnation, the flotilla video that's been released by Ben Gvir as well. And I think it's that real lack of accountability so far that has concerned so many of us. But I want to pick up on what you were starting to say about Iran, because of that. The center of much of this, of course, is Iran. Major headlines again this week in terms of what is going on. Now, you've recently argued in an interview with Times Radio that Iran often holds significant leverage in negotiations despite Western assumptions of weakness. Now, we've obviously heard big concerns, or, so we've seen big developments this week about another potential ceasefire as well. I know you also told Times Radio you felt we were many months away, a long far away from a real peace deal, but that you had hope for the MOU. I have to wonder, is Tehran genuinely interested in a durable agreement with Washington, in your opinion, or is it mainly trying to buy time and protect its regional influence?
I think Iran is interested in an agreement under its own terms, and I don't think they're going to budge. So the question really is, what terms are they going to agree to? And I think that a US president hopefully has understood by now that his threats and calls for total capitulation or total victory, it's the same problem with Netanyahu. It's this extremist maximalist view and this concept of a total victory. There is no total victory. I mean, negotiations, there has to be compromise in negotiations, and the compromise has to be on both sides in order to get to a win-win situation. So I think Iran wants to be 100% certain that it's not going to be attacked again. That, I think, is its number one concern. And number two, it has $1.2 billion in frozen assets. So it wants the sanctions relief, but it needs international guarantees to ensure that Israel and the US, and principally Israel, won't attack it again. So if the US agrees on a plan with Iran, how are they going to ensure that Israel will abide by this agreement? It's not straightforward. Israel attacked Doha, an ally of the US, close ally, and a key mediator in September of last year. So you've got precedents here. Iran, of course, was attacked twice during negotiations, in June of last year and on the 28th of February of this year. So they are right to be concerned. But I think ultimately everyone is interested in an end to this conflict. But the real question is, can they agree on terms, and can they build the necessary international guarantees so as to ensure that they can get to that point?
We're almost out of time. I want to quickly ask you, though, when you talk about us being many months away from a real peace deal, what kind of time frame do you think we're looking at?
Probably, well, it's hard to tell. It really is hard to tell. Definitely you need to wait for a new Israeli government, probably a new Palestinian government. And I don't think that Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, is doing the Palestinians many favors. So I think it's going to be staggered. And again, you're going to hit many inflection points in the nitty-gritty negotiations on the thorny issues. So I think we need to look at a framework agreement of an MOU and ensure that there is a mechanism to stabilize it and then move forward. But of course, Iran wants Lebanon to be included in that And that's going to take time to reach, I mean, I'd love to see peace between all of the Middle Eastern countries, but I think I wouldn't want to put an exact number of months on it. But I think we need to be patient and continue to work towards it, because it's the only solution. Iran's not going anywhere. Israel's not going anywhere. Palestine's not going anywhere. Lebanon's not going anywhere. And the extreme movements are not going anywhere. And we just need to build an alternative that is going to be more attractive and based, may I add, based on international law and based on UN resolutions.
Okay, well, let me ask you, because beyond those conflicts themselves, there's also a much bigger global shift we're seeing underway. China has steadily expanded its diplomatic and economic footprint right across the Middle East. Despite that, do you think Beijing can realistically challenge the US as the region's dominant power? Or is it still avoiding the political and military responsibilities that come with that role?
Well, I think we've seen China play a constructive role in many ways in diplomacy. They are, again, holding tight. I mean, they have, unlike some countries, they have a strategy, and they have played, for example, a role in getting the 18 Palestinian factions to agree on a unity, on a national unity platform. They would like to have a positive role in the region. And I think that we need to embrace China. Again, countries are not going anywhere. China isn't going anywhere. It is a force that needs to be embraced, and they need to be brought into the new security order. You see, Pakistan is like a new Pakistan, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia have a very important strategic pact. It's very, very important not to alienate any country. You alienate a country and they end up being the spoiler of any deal. So it's very, very important to recognize that there are other narratives. We don't need to agree with the narratives of the other, but we have an obligation to study them, to know them, and to try and work out, to put ourselves in the shoes of the other and try and work out what is the threat perception, what is it that makes them behave the way they do, and what is it that, how are we going to then arrive at a point at which we can reach an agreement? And of course, there's some extremes you cannot, like you mentioned, the horrific actions of Ben-Gvir, who's been convicted 8 times of criminal acts in Israel. And so there's certain people that you do not embrace, you isolate. But generally, you cannot isolate, a whole state. You need to work with the people who are there, the countries that are there, in order to reach stability first and then peace. So with Iran, do I think it's possible? Of course it's possible. But again, one needs to understand their perspective too, in order to take into account what their concerns are and work with them. And again, there has to be a compromise, and there has to be a win-win situation, which basically is stability and prosperity for all.
I mean, you say that international humanitarian law needs to be respected. I think many of us are concerned that, frankly, we're seeing international humanitarian law being weakened right in front of our own eyes.
Yes, and that is a very serious problem. And that's a trajectory that needs to be changed. So I think we absolutely need to ensure that there is an understanding of what the red lines are. And, President Trump says he doesn't care about the law and he has good instincts, but that has been part of the problem. He had a feeling that was the time to attack Iran, is what he said, and he'll have a feeling when it's time to end it. But he didn't seek the approval of Congress. He didn't seek the approval of the United Nations Security Council for these actions. That has consequences. And you started, your first question was whether Epic Fury was an epic catastrophe or something along those lines. And I said yes. And I think that is part of the problem, is that there wasn't the international approval of the international bodies in order to ensure that, and this was a problem also in Iraq in 2003. Bush and Blair went to war without the international, the international law behind them. And I think that is a very serious problem. And I think that's one of the lessons learned, that we do need to change that trajectory. I just want to say that I do feel the winds are changing, and I do think that the people in the region, and the people certainly in Israel, but not only, want peace, but they also want to be sure that their security concerns, and we haven't discussed Israel's security concerns. I do think that after the 7th of October, there isn't the belief that anybody will protect Israel, and I think that has to be built into the agreement. So we need to look at the security guarantees for all states, for Iran, for all the Gulf states that have been attacked by Iran, and also for Israel. So there has to, and for Lebanon, for Gaza, for Palestine, obviously. So there has to be a discussion, a serious discussion of what security guarantees and what are the mechanisms will enforce those and secure those for all the states in the Middle East.
Absolutely. And I think the big concern is that while certainly Israel is not respecting international humanitarian law, Mr. Trump has now gone past the 60-day limit to ask Congress for permission to continue this now illegal war. I think the big concern is that why would any other nations in the world respect international law when we've seen these failures? But we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ms. Bar-Yaacov. It's been a real pleasure getting to hear your insider's perspective on the peace negotiations and the process we're looking at today. Thank you very much for joining us on Frankly Speaking.
Thank you very much, Katie, for this in-depth interview. And I very much hope that we will get to peace and that this interview will promote the understanding of the complex dynamics. And I really appreciate the having had the opportunity to speak with you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Let's hope we see that. Thank you.